What you see behind me is not Italy or Spain, it's London. June 2026 was the hottest June ever recorded in Western Europe. According to the Copernicus Climate Change Service, the month averaged 3.06 degrees Celsius above the historical baseline, while monthly and all-time temperature records were broken across several European countries. It was preceded by an intense heatwave in May and followed by further temperature spikes throughout July. And yet, as the continent baked, the question of European air conditioning adoption became impossible to ignore. Approximately 9 in 10 homes in the United States have air conditioning, compared with roughly 1 in 5 households in Europe. When you look at those numbers, a very natural question arises. Why is Europe sweating through these unprecedented summers without the cooling technology that countries such as the United States, Japan, and South Korea largely take for granted? Weirdly, this question has become part of the culture war. The story goes that Europe has little air conditioning because environmentalists and strict climate policies have prevented people from installing it. I will come back to this culture war later, not just to describe the politics, but to analyze the specific rhetorical techniques that make this story so persuasive. But first, I want to cover the engineering problem. To this end, let me begin with clarifying what we mean when we talk about Europe, because treating the continent as a single, uniform entity is misleading. Europe is divided by distinct climate zones and architectural histories. In Southern Europe, adaptation to high temperature is already well underway. More than half of households in Italy and Spain now reportedly have air conditioning. Not me, unfortunately, but that is what the statistics say. France sits at around 24%, with significantly higher ownership in southern regions. Italy, Spain, and Greece account for almost 2/3 of the European Union's residential cooling energy consumption. The more meaningful comparison is therefore between the United States and Northern and Western Europe, in places such as Germany and the United Kingdom, where adoption remains much lower. Historically, Western and Northern Europe had milder summers, and the built environment reflects this past reality. Many traditional Northern European buildings use high thermal mass materials such as stone and thick brick. These materials can absorb and store heat entering the building during the day, delaying its passage into the interior. When the sun went down and the outside air cooled, residents could open their windows and allow the building to discharge that heat overnight. This strategy, known as passive night ventilation, works well when nighttime temperature falls sufficiently. But climate change is altering the dynamic. Daytime peaks are increasing, and crucially, nights are becoming warmer. When the outside temperature no longer falls enough to flush the heat from the masonry, buildings may not discharge sufficient heat before the following day and can continue releasing it into living spaces long after sunset. Economic and structural factors also played a role. Many European countries have historically had relatively high electricity prices compared with the United States. A significant share of the population rents its home, creating a split incentive. The landlord has little motivation to install an expensive permanent cooling system, while the tenant may be unable to modify the building. Most importantly, consumers considered mechanical cooling unnecessary for what used to be a limited number of uncomfortably hot days each year. Despite claims from some political parties, an extensive investigation by The Guardian found very little evidence that environmental regulation or climate concerns were the principal explanation for Europe's historically low air conditioning adoption. Put simply, Europe's building economics and cultural expectations developed around a climate in which mechanical cooling was rarely considered necessary. Those historical circumstances are now being instrumentalized for political points. I will analyze these rhetorical techniques later. However, it is useful now to see how this narrative is actually being used in European politics. In France and Germany, air conditioning has become a symbol of an increasingly polarized argument. On the populist right, it is presented as an immediate common-sense solution suppressed by environmental ideology.
Il faut un grand plan clim, évidemment, et j'avoue que quand je vois un grand...
Marine Le Pen and the National Rally have made the mass installation of air conditioning a prominent proposal while opposing several major climate and renewable energy policies. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany has explicitly attributed low adoption to climate ideology, arguing that environmental construction policies are placing lives at risk during extreme heat. On the other side, among some politicians and environmental groups, there is a corresponding fear that mass adoption will create a vicious cycle. Those concerns have a physical basis. Poorly designed cooling systems consume substantial electricity, may rely on refrigerants with high global warming potential, and must expel the heat removed from a building into the surrounding environment. Under some conditions, widespread and inefficient air conditioning can measurably intensify local urban heat. But the political division is not absolute. Climate-positive parties and health organizations also support targeted cooling in hospitals, care facilities, schools, and homes containing vulnerable people. Europe's air conditioning debate has therefore been reduced to a false political choice between protecting people and protecting the climate. But whatever the politics, the historical situation is now changing. As millions of homes in Northern and Western Europe begin installing air conditioning anyway, a more practical question emerges. What will happen to the electricity grid? The first element to consider is peak power. Power grids must keep generation and consumption closely balanced. When millions of households operate air conditioning during the same hot afternoons and evening, the result is a substantial increase in peak power. We can already observe this effect. The International Energy Agency found that during the early summer heatwaves of 2025, France, where air conditioning ownership is about 25%, recorded an evening electricity peak that was 25% above the off-season average. In New York City, where air conditioning ownership is about 90%, the evening peak was about 90% higher. If Europe experienced an American-style increase in cooling demand without accounting for it in system planning, it could substantially reshape summer electricity peaks. Great Britain is a useful case study because adoption remains low, but its future trajectory is highly uncertain. The National Energy System Operator, NESO, estimates that around 3% of British homes currently use air conditioning. By 2050, its scenario ranges from only 5% to 40%, a large uncertainty. The UK Energy Research Centre estimates that in a high adoption scenario, domestic air conditioning could add approximately 7 gigawatts to Great Britain's summer evening peak by 2050. Britain will probably still have sufficient total generating and network capacity because its future winter peak is expected to remain considerably larger. Now, the engineering problem is complicated, but in some respects also promising. Cooling demand and solar generation overlap unusually well because the hottest hours frequently coincide with high photovoltaic output. This makes air conditioning easier to decarbonize than loads that require continuous power through cold, dark winter evenings. One comprehensive global study published in the journal Energy and Environmental Science estimated that approximately half of residential cooling demand could be supplied directly by solar photovoltaic generation, even without battery storage. The overlap is substantial, although it is not complete. In fact, a recent study argues that high cooling demand could coincide with low wind generation and declining solar output late in the day, several hours after photovoltaic generation has peaked. Despite this concern, rooftop solar can substantially reduce the impact of growing air conditioning demand. A 2026 Italian study found that on the hottest summer days, households with rooftop photovoltaic panels drew about 68% less electricity from the grid than comparable households without solar. The study also estimated that rising temperature could add cooling demand equivalent to around 5% of Italy's current residential electricity consumption, while planned rooftop solar growth could offset approximately half of that increase. Now, before we return to the culture war, if you are finding this analysis useful, liking the video is the easiest way to help it reach more people. If you live in Europe, I would also be interested to know whether you have air conditioning where you live, and whether that has changed in recent years, so let me know in the comments below. This is an independent channel, and if you would like to support it directly, you can find me on Patreon or buy me a coffee through the links below. We have now seen the historical reality, the political narrative, and the engineering consequences, so let us return to the question I promised at the beginning. What rhetorical techniques make this story so persuasive? As usual for this channel, I think it is useful to spell out the techniques being used, because the arguments made by newspapers and political parties can be mapped quite clearly onto several familiar rhetorical techniques and fallacies. The first is casual oversimplification combined with scapegoating. A complex historical outcome is reduced to one simple cause, climate ideology, and once that cause has been selected, it also provides a convenient villain. Ordinary people suffering through extreme heat are presented as the victims, while environmentalists and climate-positive politicians are presented as the people responsible for their suffering. The advantage of this story is that it is simple, emotional, and politically useful. It does not need to explain the history of European buildings, regional climates, or consumer behavior. It only needs to identify someone to blame. The second technique resembles a Motte-and-Bailey fallacy. The large claim, the Bailey, is that environmentalist and climate policies are the reason Europe never adopted air conditioning. But when challenged, the argument retreats to a much narrower, more defensible claim, the Motte. Some environmentalists criticize air conditioning, and some planning rules can make installation more difficult. That narrower statement may be true, but it does not prove the much larger historical claim. The speaker can retreat to the narrow argument whenever challenged, and then quietly return to the broader accusation once the pressure has passed. The third technique is what I would call adaptation-washing, and I believe that we will see a lot of these in the years to come, as the effects of climate change become increasingly difficult even for skeptics to deny. Political parties that have spent years opposing major climate policies are now presenting themselves as the strongest defenders of people suffering from extreme heat. They oppose many of the measures intended to limit future warming, but champions one very visible response to its consequences: air conditioning. This allows them to say, the parties that claim to care about climate change left you suffering in the heat. We are the ones offering a practical solution. In other words, they appropriate climate adaptation to rehabilitate their own record of climate inaction. And finally, this rhetoric creates a false dilemma. Either we protect people by installing air conditioning, or we protect the climate by forcing people to suffer. But those are not the only two options. Europe can provide cooling where it is necessary, improve building design, use cleaner electricity, reinforce local networks, and continue reducing emissions. Protecting people from climate change and limiting climate change are not opposing objectives. So when this argument appears in political debate or newspapers, keep in mind these interpretations. Often what you are being offered is not a convincing explanation for Europe's low adoption of air conditioning. You are being given a simple villain, a selective version of history, and a false choice designed to make climate action look responsible for the consequences of climate change. But the underlying questions are practical. Where is cooling necessary? How efficiently can it be provided? And how can the grid supply it during the hottest hours of the year? A well-designed cooling strategy can protect people without abandoning climate objectives. Reaching that point requires looking past the culture war, understanding the engineering of the built environment, and preparing the electricity system for a climate that has already begun to change. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.